One suspects, again, that this may be tied to the prohibition of marriage that some are arguing for in chapter 4. That is to say, maybe some think that celibacy is a higher spirituality. That was certainly common in the 2nd and 3rd century. No reason to think it doesn't go back to the 1st century. Because in much of the Greco-Roman world, you have some kind of bifurcation. It's not a universal perception, but it's a common bifurcation that the matter can be tied up with what is bad and spirit with what is good. So one effect of that was to head toward asceticism of some sort. The other effect was that in some circles, people went toward hedonism. The body isn't important. It just dies. What's important is what happens in your spirit. So you can show your freedom from the body by living like the world and the flesh and the devil. So some people out of this sort of reasoning headed toward a kind of hedonism. Others went toward a sort of asceticism. And if you hold, therefore, that you're more spiritual if you're celibate, then Paul responds that if there are people teaching this, you've got to understand that the framework in which women normally are saved, the context in which this takes place is in being married and having children. Now that bites less 100 years ago than it does today, where we have so many dinks. Double income, no kids. I've got a raft of relatives on one side of the family where there aren't many Christians around who are dinks. It's one of the reasons why in Western Europe, for example, there is no country in any part of Europe with a reproductive birth rate of 2.1 or higher, which is necessary for sustaining the population. Not one. It's because we've got all kinds of couples now that are producing one child, a few that produce two, the odd one that produces three, but many that don't produce any. They're dinks, double income, no kids. You can live at a better standard of living. Take holidays overseas 2 or 3 times a year. Of course, it hasn't dawned on too many of them yet. They're all boomers and later. It hasn't dawned on too many of them yet how lonely and broken down old age is going to be. And what happens to the economy of nations when you don't even produce the number of workers needed to sustain the present level? What that means for immigrant patterns? There are huge studies that are developing on these matters nowadays. They're really scary. And it's not just in Europe. It's in Japan, parts of China because of their birth policy now beginning to be reversed. But after all, 100 years ago, nobody would have even argued like that. 50 years ago, people wouldn't have argued like that. We argue like this now because of the pill. It was simply understood that intrinsic to marriage and the procreation of the race and so on, the normal context for a people to live and serve and die was in the context of the family. And for women, this meant that was the context in which they normally lived. They got married and they had children, and that was the context in which they were saved. I don't think the text is saying more than that. But it does raise some very fundamental issues about where our own priorities are. I don't think that it is demanding that everybody be a stay-at-home mom. There is that very notable woman in Proverbs 31 who seems to have quite a CV. But it does mean that there is a certain priority to the family and the rearing of children that must not be gainsaid and must not be set aside.